It's one person in the food line. I don't think they need this. I'm gonna switch to our class.
Okay.
Want to get started? Let me
Sure.
introduce it.
Okay, you want to just tell them what we're doing?
All right, good morning. We're going to get started here. This is sort of the first grand rounds of the new academic year, so welcome to all of you who are new and welcome back to all of you who aren't. The training office is trying to start something here. We're going to make it very overt, very obvious, all the things that we do in the background, all the paperwork we mostly try to protect you from, but it's good for you to be aware of these things as well. So we're going to cover a couple things today. Some will be of more interest than others, but they're all important. One is the ACGME guidelines for programs, and this is every psychiatry program in the country that has an ACGME affiliation, which we do. So we'll talk about that. Dr. Reis will present on that. Then I'm going to talk about competencies and milestones, and this is also something that affects every residency program in all specialties, but it is a relatively new thing. I think we've had them about 3 years, and it represented a real change in the thinking in terms of evaluation and how we measure things. So I'll cover that portion. And then lastly, mostly of interest to the residents, but also to the attendings, because it's a change for all of us, is the move from New Innovations to Medhub. And that was effective July 1, so whether you know it or not, we're already on Medhub. But some of you who are sort of in the middle of your training are getting caught in the transition, so we want to make sure that goes as smoothly as possible, as well as making sure that Christy here, I think, goes over with you what you need to do going forward with Medhub. So with no further ado, it's with great pleasure I'll introduce my co-presenter today, Dr. Jessica Reis, our new Associate Program Director, and she'll talk to us about the ACGME.
Thanks. I guess technically, actually, I'm still a resident until tomorrow, but this is my final presentation of residency, I guess. So here's our objectives for today. Again, like Dr. Caudill already mentioned, we'll go through the ACGME common program requirements for residency training in psychiatry. Specifically, we'll focus on the changes that have occurred with the learning and working environment, which is the updated duty hours that went into effect July 1st, how they might affect us, and then specifically what parts of, or what you actually need in your curriculum to graduate from an ACGME accredited psychiatry residency program. And then we'll go into the milestones, and we'll finish up with the transition to Medhub. So we hear about the ACGME all the time, which is the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. And there's a wealth of information on their website about what they do and the whole process for accreditation. So I won't bore you with the entire process, but just a few things about kind of their purpose and their mission, since we have such an important relationship with them. So basically the ACGME, the big thing they do is they accredit sponsoring institutions and residency and fellowship programs. So our sponsoring institution would be like U of L and affiliated hospitals, and then so they accredit the institution and then also our individual programs. They also recognize additional program formats or components, and that includes like the osteopathic programs. And they are really big into dedicating resources for initiatives that address important issues in graduate medical education. So overall, their goal is to improve graduate medical education and enhance healthcare in this country. So how is the organization made up? So it's a private nonprofit organization. It sets the standards for what graduate U.S. medical graduates need to do to become a fully licensed physician in their specific field. So again, they sponsor, there's institutions that sponsor these residency programs. And currently, I believe like last year, there was 800 institutions that the ACGME accredited. That was like 10,000 residency programs. So obviously, you can just multiply that out, many more residents that are within ACGME accredited programs. So the process of accreditation is overseen by a review committee, and it's basically made up of a bunch of volunteers of specialty experts within each specialty. In about 2009, they moved to what they call a new accreditation system, and this is basically a continuous accreditation system. So rather than just coming in every 5 years and reviewing all of our documents as far as the clinical experiences that the residents are getting and evaluations and board pass rates and things like that, we are now required to basically submit a lot of this information annually and throughout the year. So Christy is always entering information into a system that goes to the GME office that allows us to maintain our continuous accreditation. So that's that annual program data. They also take a look at our board pass rates. The resident clinical experience is a huge part of this, which we'll get into in more detail when we talk about the ACGME program requirements. And then you all take the resident, fellow, and faculty surveys each year. The faculty part is new, and that's where we always talk about that this is the big survey that they look at every year for making big improvements within our program. They require that we do semi-annual resident reviews about the milestones, so we'll touch on that a little bit further. And then what we're currently preparing for now is this 10-year self-study and self-study site visit. And a new piece to this with the new accreditation system is the clinical learning environment review site visit, which some of you may have been involved with last year. So to just kind of jump into the common program requirements, the ACGME basically has common program requirements for there's like general ones for all of residents in every single specialty, and then there's specific requirements obviously for each specialty. So these are the components, and we'll focus mostly on these last three. So the educational program includes the curriculum and scholarly activity. So basically, I know this is really tiny, and you can pull all of this up on the ACGME website. I kept it all in the same format so that if you want to read more about anything in particular. Basically, the curriculum includes, actual didactic curriculum, but then that's pretty, it can be kind of loosely interpreted as far as it doesn't say that you need to have a set number of hours in education in a classroom setting on such and such topics. What they more emphasize is the actual clinical rotations that you need to get experience in. So, of course, that goes into how we build the schedule each year. So, required clinical experiences, this is just a few notes about kind of what the settings must be like, that they want you to see a sufficient number of patients. They want you to be basically the primary physician taking care of those patients, and just kind of what types of things that should be involved in the care for those patients. So this is where we actually get into the specifics of what's required. And so again, wherever you ended up for psychiatry residency training, you would have to make sure that that program met these requirements. So within the first year of your training, you have to do at least 4 months of primary care. So here we accomplish that by doing the internal medicine, pediatrics, and emergency medicine usually. They can't have, your first year, you can't have any more than 8 months of specific psychiatry training. So usually our intern year is 6 months of psychiatry, so we meet that. And then your neurology experience, the reason we put that in the first year is that at least 1 month of it must be in the first or second year. So they just want you to get that experience early on. Inpatient psychiatry experience, you have to have at least 6 months in your training, and you can't have more than 16 months, which a lot of programs are pretty heavy on inpatient training. And kind of the way you get around this a little bit is things like child and adolescent rotations, those are counting as child and adolescent rather than inpatient rotations. So a big important one is your outpatient psychiatry has to be 12 months of continuous outpatient service. So that's why the entire third year is dedicated to outpatient. Child and adolescent, you have to have 2 months, which is what we require here, and usually what people get unless there's a request for more. Then you have to have 1 month of dedicated geriatric psychiatry. So currently we have that rotation at the VA, and I know Dr. Casey has been precepting a clinic at our outpatient clinic, the geriatric clinic, but that actually can't count as your geriatric experience. You still have to do your rotation at the VA because it has to be 1 month of full-time experience in geriatrics. Addiction psychiatry is the same way. We have an addictions clinic at the HCOC. However, you have to spend 1 month continuous on an addiction service. So right now, again, that's completed over at the VA at SARP, but now we're going to have residents rotating over at CARC with Dr. McCurdy, who's here. So this could also be something that we could see changing in the future, as far as just since we're going to have more sites available. You must complete at least 2 months of CL psychiatry, which we usually kind of go above and beyond that. As far as forensics experience, this is something that came up in a lot of the evaluations that we looked at, the internal surveys that you guys completed at the end of the year, as far as wanting more forensics experience. So currently we don't have like a full-time forensics experience, which is okay with the ACGME. Basically, this is what you need to do, they feel like, to have sufficient forensics experience. And we do these things on a regular basis, evaluating potential harm to themselves or others, appropriateness for commitment, which we do on a daily basis, decisional capacity, which is what we're doing on the CL service all the time too. Again, with kind of the same with emergency medicine, you don't necessarily have to have a specific amount of time dedicated to like an EPS rotation like we have, but you must have some type of organized rotation in emergency psychiatry. So it's not just on-call experience going over to the emergency room. It's actually like dedicated time to evaluating crisis situations and management of patients in the emergency room. Community psychiatry, we have the luxury of going out into the community and rotating on our outpatient rotations at Centerstone, but technically through the ACGME, you just have to have exposure to chronically mentally ill and learning about some of the community resources, which I think we meet that requirement probably even just from working in EPS. So even if you're not rotating at Centerstone, we meet that requirement. They specify that any electives that are completed within the program just need to have some type of written curriculum goals and objectives, but there isn't any set amount. So moving on to the evaluation process within the common program requirements, we'll just kind of briefly touch on what they require. And so this is why we do certain types of evaluations or take certain types of tests within the program. So there must be a clinical competency committee, which is involved in evaluating residents for promotion, for advancement throughout the program. And Dr. Caudill will touch more on this when we talk about the milestones. So basically, you have semi-annual reviews with someone in the training office, and that information, along with all of your different evaluations, test scores, things like that, are all reviewed by the CCC, and then you're basically scored somewhere on the milestones and either approved for advancement or not, or it can be listed as that you have there's some concerns. As far as any formative evaluation, it's required that we do the objective PRIDE exam and that we offer the clinical skills exam that beginning in the second year. It's also required by the ACGME that we have the clinical skills evaluations. So basically, those are like where you have to be able to show that you can interview a patient and formulate a case with a psychiatrist observing, and then you have to complete at least 3 of those during your residency, and then these are also required by the board in order to sit for your boards. And then again, demonstrating proficiency in the core competencies, which is where we'll discuss those in the milestones. Other forms of evaluation are going to include faculty evaluation, which you all are asked to do on a regular basis, and then the program evaluation and improvement, which again are surveys, internal surveys that are completed, and then we have to show to the ACGME that we're working on different things that are brought up in those evaluations. So the final aspect of the common program requirements that I want to go over is the learning and working environment. So this was formerly called the duty hours. And within it doesn't just include duty hours. So within the learning and working environment, they recognize all of these other aspects of just the environment that you're working on that are very important, including things like, preventing fatigue and promoting well-being, professionalism. And so you all can find tons and tons of information about these topics on the ACGME website, but I just want to make sure that we highlight kind of what the current duty hour requirements are, what's changed over the starting July 1, and how that might affect you guys. So here they are pretty much lined out. So number 1 has not changed. We have the 80-hour work week. That includes all clinical education and moonlighting and home call. So just really important to remember that when you are logging hours that you do have to include your moonlighting hours, and so need to pay attention to make sure you're not going over that 80-hour work week, which we usually don't run into any problems with. There is a mandatory time free of not only clinical work but also education. So technically, what they're requiring now is that there's 8 hours off in between clinical work, and anytime it says clinical work and education periods, that's lumped together. So basically, just 8 hours off between your shifts. There used to be a requirement that in the first year that after working a 16-hour shift that the intern had to be off for 10 hours straight, and so that's gone away. Basically, everybody has to be off for 8 hours in between shifts. If you work a 24-hour shift, then you have to have 14 hours free of work and education. So where that always comes into play is if you work on a Friday and then you work Friday night in EPS, you cannot work Saturday night in EPS because you would only have 12 hours off. That's usually the only place that comes up. And then you have to have 1 in 7 days free of clinical work, and that's averaged over 4 weeks. So if you work the weekend, you can still work the whole next week. If then, say, you're off the following 2 days, like the following 2 days of the weekend. So it basically just comes out to happen to have 4 days off a month. The maximum clinical work and education period length. So again, this has changed for the intern year starting July 1. Every resident is now allowed to work 24-hour shifts. And you can add an additional 4 hours of time for transitions of care or resident education. There are a couple of exceptions to these policies. So in some rare circumstances, if the resident chooses to, they can come back after a 24-hour shift, again, on kind of rare occurrences and at their own will, to take care of like a critically ill patient or attend to like what they would refer to as humanistic needs, like where it would just be inappropriate to step out on a family, like if you need to go back and have a discussion with a family about a critically ill patient. And although you can do that, those hours are still counted towards your 80-hour work week. And then this is something that never comes up in our program, but I can imagine that it does in others. There is a review committee that can approve exceptions to these rules so that when residents are on really busy services, that they can go over the 80-hour work week. I don't see us petitioning for anything like that, though. Again, just to note that moonlighting counts towards the 80-hour work week. It must not interfere with your ability to perform your duties here or with any educational programming. So you can't leave early. You can't like skip class to go moonlight. PGY1s are not permitted to moonlight. As far as the duty hours regarding call, in-house night float, must, again, fit within the 80-hour work week, which ours does, and you have to have 1 and 7 days off per week. So we meet both those requirements since our night float is at 5 days in a row. You can't have more call than every third night, which I don't think ever comes up here. And at-home call, time spent on patient care activities counts towards the 80-hour work week. But if you were just like sitting at home with the pager, like for instance, when you have the pager in the evening, those hours don't count towards your 80-hour work week. Let's see. So we'll go ahead and move on, or we can, if anybody has any questions about those changes to the duty hours or any questions at this point, we can, yeah, Missy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not positive actually why it required us to even document that strategic break, because technically you can work a 24-hour shift. Do you know why it made us do that? I know. Yeah.
With Medhub,
It shouldn't be an issue now. Yeah. Because technically, I mean, you aren't working those 3 hours, so I think it was just something to fill the space. But you can work a 24-hour shift, so technically you could be working those 3 hours. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It has to be averaged over 4 weeks. So it can be like, so technically you could work every day of the month except for like 2 weekends. You could have 2 whole weekends off. And that's how it's always been. So that's why, like with the kind of like how internal medicine does the 4 days off a month, I think usually on our inpatient units, we end up getting a couple, more like 5 or 6 days. But technically it can be averaged over the month. And I guess I should just, oh, yeah, Dr. Campbell.
Yeah, I was just kind of remembering, I think Medhub can relate to this. He got stuck when we had several people had to be off because the guy was here, and he went like for years without a day off. So don't be afraid to speak to him and say, hey, I have some help because we will definitely find, even if I have to
Right. Right. Yeah, we actually rarely have any duty hour violations, and I'm not sure how much of that is due to the way that the hours are reported, but I really encourage you to record your hours accurately, so that we can spot any potential like problems within the current system that need to be adjusted, that need to be addressed. I think one of the areas, our interns are not going to be working 24-hour shifts, so that change is really not going to affect anything at this point. We're not talking about that affecting anything in the near future. But I do think that the ability to, be able to come into work after 8 hours is probably a little bit more reasonable than what like that 10-hour requirement was in the past few years. I think that's where we occurred a lot of violations, was because you'd finish up a call shift in the evening, and then you technically couldn't come to work, say, till, I don't know, whatever time, 8 o'clock the next day or something. Mm-hmm. No, so what it should be in the new handbook that they should be returning to their site in the morning, going into their site in the morning on Monday morning. However, they should not. They should be trying to leave by like noon. So taking care of any like patient care needs that need like transitions of care, and any patient care that's not new patient care, so not taking on new patients. Because it was the holiday. So the goal is to like get out at an efficient time, but there technically isn't. We've always said noon, but technically that's not because of duty hours. It's more just to take care of residents. But yeah, that shouldn't come up as much this year since they're not going to be working Sunday nights. Other questions? No, they don't specify, but I believe it's 24 hours. Yeah. Yeah. So it shouldn't be if you work like a Saturday night, you were not off on Saturday during the day, right? Because you've gone in at 8 p.m. Yeah. 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 That should not be, we should try to prevent that as much as possible. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You cannot, because you've technically worked a 24-hour shift. Even though you've had that break there, that's not a long enough break to qualify as being two separate shifts, right? Yeah. Yeah, really the only time we ever do 24-hour calls anymore is because of night float being in effect during the week is really Friday night, Friday during the day and then Friday night. Other questions? Okay. We'll move into the psychiatric competencies and milestones then.
All right, I'll just follow up on the whole duty hour thing. Has been sort of a work in progress. It hasn't always been around in medicine. Um, it certainly exists for residencies, and it's the water we swim in, I guess. But when you get out of training, guess who doesn't have duty hour caps or anything? So Dr. Campbell and I, the old work hour rule before they brought this in was that there were 24 hours in a work day, and you could only work 24 of those. And then the next day, the same rule applied, and so it kind of continued. Residencies would kind of get a reputation if they just crushed people with their work, then it attracted a certain kind of resident that wanted to do that, and it just scared a bunch of us away, and we didn't go to those programs. So, but we all have more of a consistent thing. Down at the bottom here is a URL for the documents. I emailed that, I think, to everyone in the residency yesterday. So if you want to actually look at the source documents for what we're talking about today, I would encourage you to download that yourself and look at it. Excuse me. I think many of you did we give them a hard copy of these things? You at least the interns I know all get a hard copy of these things to look at. So, and there's two ways to look at this stuff, particularly the ACGME guidelines. I didn't grow up always wanting to be a training director, so I had to kind of hit the ground running and figure out what this was all about. And what made the most sense to me and still makes the most sense to me is rather than trying to look at our program and go, how do we dovetail this and sort of say that we meet these requirements, is that we just build the residency from the ground up around these requirements. So we should be meeting this pretty effortlessly. If we're not, it's not because we're not trying. We actually look at the guidelines, and that's what we decide the residency ought to be. So just background on that. So I'm going to talk to you about something that's somewhat new, and that is the ACGME milestones. Measurement in education is nothing new. I mean, people have been taking tests as long as they've been taking classes. And most of you, at least probably during a large portion of your training, had this sort of A, B, C, D, E, F, right, not the E, but the F, grading scale, or a Likert scale, 1 through 5. 1 meant you were terrible, 5 meant you were great, and you all got 4s and 5s because you're all here in our psychiatry program. So people got used to getting that. The milestone is a totally different way of looking at it, though. It's not a Likert scale kind of continuum between bad and good. It's really a skill acquisition model, moving from novice to mastery. And so that's been imposed on all of the training programs. It was developed, again, by ACGME review committees. This was not unique to psychiatry. This is a graduate medical education initiative, and it's about 10 years in the making. and it kind of got implemented in the past 3 or 4 years, I guess, is when it came up. But they decided that there were sort of 6 core areas, and we'll come on that in just a second. Again, all ACGME accredited programs are using this. 2009 is when it really began rolling out. 2005 is when I think the last one came on board. And the idea here is to make the assessments just more meaningful, more valuable. So in terms of this rating, it's a 5-point rating scale, much like the Likert, but again, in a skill acquisition model, it takes on a different thing. So level 1 is what are the expectations of a resident beginning their experience in training. Not everyone is going to come in and meet level 1. I mean, some people have been out of school longer than others. Some people need to be remediated a little bit. You don't fail the program if you don't get a 1. You just have to be brought up to it. It's just an awareness. It makes us know that that's something we have to work on. Level, the explanation here is kind of self-explanatory. You can look that over. Now, you would say, well, we have a 4-year program, so shouldn't I move along exactly just 1 point per year? And to some degree, that is true. I mean, I can't get away from that. But there's also places where it's grossly out of alignment. There's different milestones measure different things, and you get different pieces of your training at different PGY levels. So, for instance, the bulk of your CL work will come in your 2-year. And so you could easily be up as high as you're ever going to get in terms of that skill acquisition. At the end of your 2nd year, you may not add a lot to that in years 3 and 4. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But the expectation is you're going to get most of your skill acquired there in those first couple of years. Other things, however, like we don't talk about QI initiatives much until you're probably late in your 2 or your 3 years. So you could have a very low score in QI up until you get exposure to that in didactics and projects and things. So it's not a perfect tracking system. It doesn't track directly across, but it does roughly sort of seem tempting to use it that way sometimes. So where did this all come from, and where does this information all go? Basically, there's always been a committee that sort of did this. We call it the Resident Advancement Committee for decades, and that was a committee that met twice a year, went over all of the rotational reviews, and decided, is this resident ready to move on to the next stage of training? We just basically took that same committee, more or less, and folded it into the newly named Clinical Competency Committee. Now, these are being done all over the country, so every program was sort of adapting and adjusting to this at the same time. And as I mentioned to some of you before, there's a very lively listserv out there for training directors. So we were pretty good about comparing notes and how we're going to do it. The general philosophy is that the Clinical Competency Committee serves as a sort of consultant, a resource to the training director. The training directors are not intended to chair them or to lead them necessarily. I'm the recipient of the data coming out of that meeting. So now, in ours, because, and like many others, I not only serve on the committee, I did chair the first few, but that was just to kind of get it up and running. At this point, I think the committee is sort of evolving, and my role to that will become more ex officio, which is kind of as it should be. But this is the sort of input that the committee receives. So everything that is a rating scale or the 360-degree reviews, if the staff at the clinic turns in a review of your experience, all of that becomes grist for the mill for the Clinical Competency Committee. And they come up with composite numbers that hopefully meaningfully reflect a sort of a consensus. I think at this point, we don't have as many attending in the room as I would hope, but this is being recorded and they can see it later, and we've talked about it in different settings. At this point, I do think pretty much all the attendings have gotten the idea and the concept of the rating scale being not a Likert scale, but as recently as a year ago, we were still getting people turning in, for the intern rotations, giving them 5s and stuff. I mean, you're all great and all that, but you're not a 5 probably on many of these milestone scales in your intern year. That's just kind of not humanly possible. So anyway, these are the sort of stuff we get. We get all this information, and the Clinical Competency Committee sort of sits down and bats it around. And we know who historically rates a little bit on the high side and who historically rates on the low side, and we try to factor that in and come up with some number that's meaningful. So here are the 6 core competency areas that cut across all medical specialties. When this first rolled out, they used the acronym PIMPS to help mnemonically remember that. And then here at the university, we mean different things by that with our sports program and stuff. So we moved to a different acronym. But whatever helps you remember them is probably going to be useful. And again, these are the core competencies apply to urology. I mean, these same sort of core cut across every single specialty. How the sub-competencies manifest themselves are what's more of interest to you guys, and that's kind of what we'll talk about. But they all make sense. They're all things you've heard us talk about. And it does help us drill down on specific areas. So rather than saying, is this a good resident or not a good resident, we can say, the medical knowledge is great here, but there's some work on interpersonal communication skills that needs work. So we can kind of isolate your strengths, your weaknesses, and maybe target interventions that'll help you maximize your experience here. So let's talk about the first one on the list, and this is practice-based learning and improvement. There are 22 sub-competencies listed in psychiatry. And I've listed in parentheses here the number that go under each of these 6 associated with that. So the practice-based learning and improvement area, you can read this. There are 5 of those, and we'll drill down into those specific 5 here in just a second. Then in terms of medical knowledge, there are 6 of those. So 6 of the 22 sub-competencies are related to medical knowledge. And on the faculty review of your rotations, for instance, not all 22 sub-competencies are equally related on all residency rotations. So we won't ask a particular clinical site to review a sub-competency where we don't think you get any exposure to it on that site. So we do ask each faculty member to review the residents on their service against these sub-competencies, the 6 that are listed here, for instance, on medical knowledge. But we recognize that not every rotation offers, say, 22 of them. Matter of fact, most of them offer about half of that. So we do try to adjust the things that you're being measured against relative to the specific rotation. I will also say, for instance, you wonder, well, what does PRITE have to do with any of this? The PRITE scores factor into a major way in this medical knowledge stuff. We will look at your PRITE scores in the subcategories and apply that to how you're scoring in medical knowledge, for instance. That's just a very easy, objective way to look at it and come away with something that seems to hold up. Systems-based practice. 4 of the 22 sub-competencies relate to this. You can kind of appreciate, the global statement here. We'll drill down into what these 4 sub-competencies look like here in a second. Patient care and procedural skills are 3 of the 22. Professionalism is 2 of the 22. And, I would not presume to say that, like, the 22 are equally weighted or anything. I mean, to me, if 21 look great, but professionalism looks bad, that one jumps out, right? So they're not equally weighted. They're just ways to kind of look across them and measure things. And then I think lastly is interpersonal and communication skills, and there are 2 of those as well. I think that's it. No, there's one more, maybe. No, that's it. Okay, so anyway, here's how they're rated on levels 1 through 5, sort of actualized and described. We do have, I'll show you a sample of what the milestone rating card looks like that we actually use. And it's possible to score below a level 1, and that's what you do, if you really haven't gotten a certain skill that might have been expected on day 1. Again, it's not the end of the world. It just the card has to have a way to reflect that. We don't use that one very often. But level 1 is where you should be as an incoming resident. The idea is sort of, if you look at it in a way, too, and again, I'm sort of contradicting myself here perhaps, but we would love to see people be at a level 4 at the end of their 4th year on as many of these as possible. You don't require a 4 or a 3 to finish a program. That's not tied to that. Supposedly, these numbers do not go outside the program. They're all held, privately in your file here. I do have concerns over time. There'll be increasing push for us to release these things. There'll be increasing push for outside agencies to get a hold of them. I think that there's a widespread acknowledgement at the moment that the methodology, the way we do this, is far too subjective to see that go that direction. And we will certainly, I'll be pushing back against that, but I don't decide where everything goes for the field. Level 2, level 3, you can sort of see the descriptors on those. Level 5 is an aspirational level, if you want to think about it. So it would be a rare resident that would achieve level 5 in a particular area, but it happens. It certainly can happen. If you came here and you'd done some research in some specific area, let's say, before you got here, and you continued your research while you were here, and you published in that area, nationally, you could wind up having a level 5 in some area of the subcompetencies. But it's not common. I would say if you look around the faculty, most of us hope to be a 5 in a few areas of our particular area of academic interest, but it's not like faculty are 5s across the board if you rated them against deliverables on this, and nor could we be. It's kind of a superhuman thing. So here's what the actual sheet looks like, and with all the labeling, and this is what we're looking at when we do this. So what's important to know is that each sheet that we look at has a competency domain. Let's see if there's a pointer here. Does that pointer show up here? Yeah, it does. Great. So the competency domain is PBLI 13. That means patient-based learning and instruction. Number 3, and the specific label for that is teaching. And then these are the 2 threads within the teaching subcompetency: development as a teacher, and then observable teaching skills. And as you look down through here, this red box, for instance, is the thread involving development as a teacher, and each one of these little bullet point numbers has a /A associated with it, which tells you that it's connected to that particular thread. And then, of course, here's the B thread. And the particular milestone is this thing, is do you do that? Now, you get credit for a particular milestone status. You have to have 2 things happen. One is you have to demonstrate the skill, right? You have to be able to do what it says you're doing. But, if a tree falls in a forest and doesn't make a sound, if you're doing all these wonderful things, but your attending doesn't see you do that, then they have no way of rating it, right? So you don't get credit. So if you look at a milestone review, for instance, and you can go online and look at all these, they'll be up on Medhub. They certainly were on New Innovations. They're usually in the form of a spider graph, but there's lots of different ways to look at it. And you go, well, I actually have that skill set, and I wasn't recognized for that. Then that's information we need to have back, and maybe we can help you figure out why you didn't get the credit for it, because the chances are you did not demonstrate it to the attending on the service where it was measured. So that's important. We can pick a box. Most likely, the boxes go with the level 2, but we have the option of picking like a 2.5. There's these in-between boxes. And I'll tell you where that comes up a lot is like at 6-month reviews. So in the mid-year, a lot of people who are acquiring a skill might get that bump in the middle. Selecting a box in the line between that's just what that's saying. And there's sort of the threads. So that's what we're looking at. Does that make sense, everybody? That's how you kind of look at it that way. So let's drill down into these. These are the 5 patient care and procedural skills. You mostly would have a familiarity with this. This should be probably new only to the interns, but psychiatric evaluation, that's where it all starts, right? So that's a good place to start here. And these are the kind of things we would expect to see you do. Next is formulation differential diagnosis. This is a more advanced skill. I mean, diagnosis should be in the ballpark, but formulation takes a while. Not everybody comes in here with good formulations. Most people, that's a skill you work on your entire career. Treatment planning and management, again, that's also more of an advanced skill in some ways. The CSV doesn't measure that per se. The CSV is really just can you take a history and can you report a history? So your 3 CSVs could have a fairly low level of planning and management, but we do score it here. The other patient care procedural skills, this is can you do psychotherapy? And you'll see some of these things that recur in 2 different areas. For instance, psychotherapy shows up here, but it also will show up in the medical knowledge. Do you know about psychotherapy? And can you tell me the different techniques? Can you explain that to somebody? And secondly, can you do it? And so this is where we're talking about patient care procedural skills. This is where psychotherapy shows up. Somatic therapy shows up. PC5, for instance, people tend to do better at earlier because you're coming off of inpatient units. You're gaining a lot of somatic therapy skills, but you're not doing a lot of psychotherapy until starting year 2, really, in terms of a formal structured approach. So that's where you see some of these things lag. It's not as if you throw a pebble into a pond and the ripples come out equally and perfectly symmetrically. You'll sort of see a depiction of that when we get to the spider graph. So medical knowledge is the next area. So, when we talked about patient care skills, we had 5, but we have 6 listed here. Medical knowledge 1 is development through the life cycle. Again, you're going to get your biggest exposure to this on 2 months of child psychiatry. So we're going to look for them to really rate you on that. So the reviews that come back from the child services carry a lot of weight in here. But also PRITE scores in this sub-area also get looked at. Psychopathology, all the stuff you would expect to see there. Clinical neurosciences, this is an area where a lot of you are going to score really well by the end of your first year, and then we'll factor in also, of course, information from the PRITE scores. But you got to work to keep that number up there because you don't have a lot of contact with these type of patients directly so much after your first year, and so you've got to kind of stay on top of the reading. Psychotherapy knowledge, as I mentioned, that one has its corollary in the patient care activity. Somatic therapy knowledge, and then lastly, practice of psychiatry. And practice of psychiatry is actually more of a 3 and 4. I mean, it's hard to appreciate practice of psychiatry until you've kind of done a variety of service sites. If you've never really been in the clinic much, that's where a whole lot of psychiatry takes place. So it's hard to score well there till you've gotten some experience. Systems-based practice has 4 subcompetencies, 4 of the 22. Patient safety in the healthcare team, resource management, community-based care. Some of this shows up in your community psychiatry rotations. We look at the things from Centerstone to get a sense for how you're doing with community-based programs and able to access that. Consultation and non-psychiatric medical providers, that comes on the consult service, but it also comes from working in the community as well. Also the work in the clinic and EPS, you integrate with other outside agencies. Practice-based learning and improvement, there's 3 of these. Development, execution of lifelong learning through constant self-evaluation, including critical evaluation of research and clinical evidence. Formal practice-based quality improvement based on established and accepted methodologies. This whole PBLI-2, for instance, I mean, so I don't know. If you had asked me going into this, before any of this was created, if I had to list the 22 most central core important skills for a psychiatrist, formal-based practice improvement based on, this PBLI-2 wouldn't have made my cut, okay? But that's not to say it doesn't make your cut, because it needs to be on there because it made the ACGME's cut. But I just find that one interesting that it got thrown in there. A lot of us, I mean, in my residency, I got no quality improvement. I don't even think the field much existed then, probably. But you guys will have to score, you'll be measured on it, so it needs to go on your radar. Lastly is teaching, and I showed you the drill down on that one, but teaching development as a teacher as well as observable teaching skills. Professionalism has 2, but they're 2 important ones. Compassion, integrity, respect for others, sensitivity, diverse patient population, adherence to ethical principles. Those are, pretty huge stuff. Accountability to self, patients, colleagues, and the profession. So while there's only 2 of those that carry a lot of weight. Then the last one, interpersonal communication skills, relationship, conflict with patients, families, colleagues, members of the healthcare team. Do you play well with others? Information sharing and record keeping. This is where if your notes are delinquent or we haven't hound you to turn stuff in, we've got a way to kind of objectively report that you need some work on that. Or if you have excellent notes, if your notes are very clear and concise, you can score, ahead of precociously that way. So that's kind of a summary. I mean, it's a high 30,000-foot view of them, but you can drill down into these to your heart's delight, by going online. They're PDF documents. They're easily downloadable, easily viewable. Both of these documents that we've referred to today are about 40 pages in length, accessible. This is a spider graph. This is not the specific psychiatry spider graph. I couldn't find one, but it gives you an idea of what happens. The lines radiating from the center there each represent a subcompetency. There'd be 22 of them coming out on ours. And then these evolving circles around that are levels. So you've got here, I think you see 6. And as I mentioned, we don't expect to look at this and to see these circles expanding like pebbles thrown in a pond. It does look more like this. People do gain skills at variable rates throughout the course of training. What you don't want to see and what you want is intersecting lines. That would mean a regression. Somebody's gone backwards on a skill. It could have been that they were incorrectly evaluated the first time, but it's just something we work toward. You also don't want to see people get stuck too long, at an intersecting point where they're not demonstrating growth in that area. But that can happen too. I mean, again, like I say, a lot of your consult work will be early on, and then maybe you don't get a lot better for a year or so when you don't do much consult. Those things you can all think of other examples, I'm sure. So that's kind of a quick overview of competencies in the milestone process. Any questions on that? Isn't it this the most exciting thing you'll hear all day? I will say, in an allusion to the duty hour stuff, nobody wants sleepy, tired, less than proficient clinicians out there, but a ton of work goes in on the backside to collect all that data and to process it. And so, something's lost there. It's not going back. We'll still have to collect it, but anything that streamlines that process and makes it more efficient. The less time that Christy and I and Dr. Reis are spending staying on top of duty hour stuff, the more time we're looking at curriculum development and other things that are probably more interesting to all of us. So We have to deal with duty hour stuff, but please make it as painless for all of us as you can. And I'll turn this over to Christy.
Hello. So did everybody receive their Medhub login? Did anybody not? Yes. It should have went to faculty and to residents from GME, so I will follow up on yours. But it is just your U of L, 6 letters with the 2 numbers, and then you create your password and you keep that password forever. So the way that Medhub sets up their system is that the week goes from Sunday to Saturday. So even though we are just starting Medhub, they are actually finishing their week this Saturday. So all of you will need to go in before Saturday and log your hours for this week. So the good thing about Medhub is they have a lot of bells and whistles, and once we figure them out and once we get everything inputted, it's going to be wonderful. It's just getting there that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. So right now, when you go to log your hours, you will have to drag like the hours that you worked. But we're hoping to develop it where once we can get all the hours in for certain service sites, like if you're at the HDOC and you're there 8 to 5, it will pre-populate. So just please be patient with me. I appreciate it. I want to make this as easy as possible. It just takes a little bit of time to get there, but we will. So the first thing is when you do go into Medhub, you will want to use Firefox or Chrome as your browser. It does not like Internet Explorer, which I don't really think anything does anyway. So use one of those. Also, they strongly encourage that you use the Medhub app. It's a whole lot better than the New Innovations app. You're able to like log your hours and do everything. Unfortunately, they don't have an app for anybody that has Android devices. I don't know why. So they say that they're working on it, but they haven't had one yet. So how many people have Androids? Just to kind of get an idea. Okay, good to know. So for now, you can still go to the website from your phone and navigate that way. So let's see.
I think if you hit escape, I have it pulled up like with my login. So
Awesome. So when you log in, this is the screen that you'll see. It's very simple and basic. Okay. Do you have yours pulled?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is what your home screen will look like. And eventually when we have like notifications like you need to do the KMRG training or things like that, it will show up here. You'll also get emails from me because I'm afraid that you all would miss out if I didn't send you an email every day like I do. So it will also show up in your urgent tasks. So anything that you have going up, if you're approaching the deadline, it will show up in your urgent task. If it is something like you need to log your work hours or review records, or even if you need to complete evaluations, it will all show up there. So if you click on this week's hours, this is what your week will look like. And I'm actually going to go back to the week before for Jessica. Yes. So this is what it will look like when you log your hours. The good thing about it is in New Innovations, you had to log any days off that you had, like weekends and things like that. With Medhub, you only log the hours you work. So once we get things up and running with the vacation request, it will go ahead and pre-populate that you were off that week and you won't have to worry about it. You will still have to submit your work hours just to confirm that it's not that you just didn't put your hours in, that you were out for days. But then it will show down here how many hours that you worked. And you just drag this for how many, whatever your time frame is that you work.
You just have to click like at your start time and your end time,
Mm-hmm.
and then it'll fill it in.
Yep. And then you just submit your work hours. and then it will show you at the bottom how many hours you work.
And it has this nice little box up here at the top, the weekly compliance checklist. So it shows the number of hours that you worked to make sure you didn't go over, that you had a day off. So it's noting that I was off on Sunday without me having to put in that like free of service or whatever that we had to do on New Innovations. So if you want to have green check marks all the way down the side.
Yes.
To be compliant.
And then the didactic schedule, your weekend rounding, all of that stuff will be in here. So once we get to that point, it will show all those blocks of time as well. So the main thing for now is for you to log your hours. And then we're working on the vacation stuff. All the rotations aren't in. So any time that you plan to take off, if you will still do the owed paper forms, at least for July, and then once we get the full rotation schedule in, it will automatically know that if you're scheduled to be at Norton's, it will automatically go from you to Dr. Wong back to me. So, and then once that request is approved, you will receive an email, and I think it shows up in your task, but you will receive an email saying your request has been approved. So that'll make it a little bit easier, hopefully. Yes.
I believe only for 2 weeks, though.
Yes, because they go in 2-week blocks. You have to. Yes. Right. That's all you have to do. Sorry, I'm still learning this, so bear with me. They gave us 2 half-day sessions, and it was all on like what we need to do to input it. So we didn't focus on a whole lot of what you guys had to do. So just bear with me. We're getting there together.
Go in and log your hours from this week and make sure it's submitted before Saturday, because that's if you don't submit before Saturday, then Christy has to like unlock your account.
Yes.
And then for the next 2 weeks, it'll kind of be a trial period. So you go ahead and if you're somebody who likes to like pre-log, go ahead and like log your 2 weeks and submit it, and then we'll check and make sure. So that's just kind of how we're going to going back and approving them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like it has that feature where you have to go back and approve them.
And it is a Medhub thing, not a training office thing. They do automatically lock you out if you haven't logged in 15 days. So if you haven't, then you have to come to me. And even though I love hearing from you guys, if you could avoid from that, because that does count as like professionalism and all that good stuff. So. Yeah. So go back home. Everything's at home. And there's like over on the side, we'll download like the manuals and all that stuff as well. So there's like the absence vacation request. So for any vacation days or like the conference away would be like if you're using educational days. Sick days, if you call in sick, you still need to notify your service site and me. But then if you could just go in and complete the form as well, that would be great. And then leave of absence, if something comes up, you don't need to do it on there. You just need to speak with us. So I don't think it'll let me do it for Dr. Reis, but you can just pick your day. If you want to put a reason in, you can. And then once you send the request, it will automatically go to the service site and then me. And if you don't request it more than 2 weeks in advance, then it will pop up with an error message. Yes. 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 And the other nice feature about Medhub is like now you can click on schedules and you can see where everyone is scheduled for. So I know a lot of times some people would wonder who would be on a certain service site with them or something like that. So this will be all nice and full here soon. So, and then let's see.
And I think you can also go to click on individuals. Well, it's not going to show anything from mine, but it'll show your own individual rotations for the year. So you're not always looking for like the big spreadsheet printout.
Yes, and it will include like your didactics and everything as well. So that's the two main things. The only other thing we'll cover today is for procedures. You can log your procedures, and please, if you haven't done so already, if you will log everything into New Innovations. I know we're moving away from New Innovations, but that's the one thing that they are going to carry over into Medhub, or they're supposed to. So before they deactivate our account in September, I'm going to print everybody's patient logs out. So as long as you all put them in now, if for some reason it doesn't carry over, it's not on you guys, it's on me. So if you could please go ahead and do that, that would be awesome. And then
So this is pretty similar to New Innovations, where you have to select the date for the procedure, location. You can really just do inpatient or outpatient. The specialty clinics are listed on there. So if you wanted to like show that you were getting a lot of geriatric experience or Suboxone experience, they're on there. And then you don't have to do a patient ID, but you need a gender and age. And then we added a few procedures today. I don't know. I think it covers probably everything that we need. We added like TMS and ketamine infusions, thinking those might be things that people might start to get more exposure with. You always want to put in if you do any type of couples therapy or group therapy, because that's things that we're a lot of times kind of deficient on. And then we left the diagnoses very vague so that it's easy to just select from a class of diagnoses. And I think that's the only. Yep.
if you want to put a note or complication, you can, but you don't have to.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So there's an H&P and a med check note in there.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody got their new handbooks last week. There's reminders in there about the number. I mean, you can log as many patient encounters as you want. And actually, when I was applying for my privileges at Norton Hospital, they asked for my log. So they wanted to see what types of patients I had been seeing in the past 12 months. So I know it can be a frustrating thing to do to log these things, but make sure that if you're getting like unique experiences that you do log them. So you have to have 50 in your first year and 100 each year after that.
Mm-hmm.
But you can log as many as you want.
So I'm going to confused with you. So I'm on consult liaison, so every patient that I see, I have to look in.
You do not
No.
have to log every patient. So you have to log 50 patients your intern year.
Yes.
Okay. So everybody does it differently. Some people I remember used to just kind of bring like a little logbook to EPS, and every time they were on call, they would like take a sticker off the chart and just log all the patients they saw on EPS, just to have like a standard way of doing it. Once you start your therapy clinic, because a lot of the procedures that we're talking about are therapies. So once you start your therapy clinic, you could log, say, like all your therapy patients. Definitely you want to log if you're doing any ECT or TMS, anything that's unique like that. Like you can see on there, if you have an experience in group, like where you're leading a group on one of the inpatient units this year, log that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, I think that's pretty much
Evaluations.
the evaluations. We build those off the milestones, so everything that Dr. Reis and Dr. Caudill covered. It will be the same evaluations that we had in New Innovations. So they'll be familiar, and then they'll be sent to you guys as well. And then all the conferences, your didactics will be entered in there, and then they'll send you the evaluation for that. I think that's pretty much it. Those are the main things for now. If you didn't get the handout, be sure to, and I will also email it out. But again, if you could just log your hours by Saturday, that would be awesome. Does anybody have any questions?
The other thing I wanted to ask if anybody had questions about is you did get your new residency handbook and policies and procedures, and there, I don't know if everybody sat down and read them all. Probably not, but there were, there are always kind of like changes that happen each academic year. So we just wanted to take this opportunity to see if anybody needed any clarification about any changes that like went into effect this year, or had questions about any of like the updated policies or anything.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right.
Alrighty.
Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Very entertaining.
Public speaking is not my forte.
All right. I've got an Amy Green.
Yeah.
Is that,
The Delphi.
okay, great. So you know, are you ready? Okay, yeah, let's do that then. I just wanted, I thought that's what it was.
Are you sure? You in?
That's the most informative thing.